Thank you so much.
Merci, merci.
Really, thank you so much. And believe me, it is such an honor and a privilege and delight to be here in France. Because, in my opinion, France is the last stronghold of the rational process. As you know, we have lost reason entirely in the United States. It's all. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup.
I want to begin by thanking Jean Staune and Guy Tredaniel. Yes, thank you. Because in actuality, the near-death experiences, as fascinating as they are not my primary interest. My background is logic and philosophy of language and ancient Greek philosophy. And my life's work has been trying to discern or to figure out the logic or discern the inner logic of unintelligible ideas and thought. I have spent my life working on this topic, and because it requires thinking, it's not published yet in the United States. But Jean and Guy have published my new book on the logic of the unintelligible. So for that, I thank them dearly. I should begin by explaining that I was not raised in a religious family. And to me, the notion of an afterlife was something that I only knew about through cartoons. And believe it or not, when I went to the University of Virginia at age 18, in 1962, I had no idea that anybody took the idea of an afterlife seriously. And my first week at college in reading Plato's Republic, that was the very first I had encountered serious reflection about the question of an afterlife. Because I quickly learned these early Greek philosophers were fascinated by stories of people who had been believed dead but revived. And I understood it as a concept of ancient Greek philosophy, but I had no idea that it pertained to the modern world. Yes, and then in 1965, I met Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia. And he was the first living person that I heard these accounts of a near-death experience from. And throughout that time, since then, throughout my career as a philosophy professor and then later as a psychiatrist, I have had the wonderful opportunity of talking with thousands of people from all over the world who had near-death experiences. And what I would like to do in the time I have with you today is three things. First of all, I would like to talk a little bit about what it is that the patients tell us when they are revived after a close call with death. And then out of that, we will raise the question of whether these experiences might be evidence of an afterlife. And I will go from there to state what I believe to be the central question of this, which was beautifully raised at the beginning by Professor Lambert, who pointed out that there is a very great conceptual gap between the kinds of phenomena and experiences that we regard as religious on the one hand, and on the other hand, the domain of scientific inquiry. And I would like to acknowledge that Professor Lambert said this beautifully, that what we need is some sort of conceptual or logical bridge between the domain of religious thinking and the domain of scientific. And so then I will go on and talk about some of the major difficulties that confront the prospect of establishing some sort of rational proof or credence to the notion of an afterlife. And then I will close by talking a little an issue that invariably arises with thinking about these near-death experiences, and that is the human difficulty of grief. Because I know that quite a number of you are here because you've lost loved ones to death, and you are looking to these experiences for some sort of reassurance. And I want to say, too, that I understand. I lost my first child in 1970. He was only 36 hours old, but to me, that was 9 months old. And I must confess, I have never gotten over that. Grieving is a process. I'm not sure that with the loss of one of your children, that it ever really comes to an end. Okay, so to begin, and by now, we all understand, I think, the basic pattern of what people tell us when they almost die. That is that at this point where often they hear their doctor or nurse or someone else say something like, "Oh my God, he's dead," or "We've lost him." And at this point, people begin to enter into a transcendent experience that changes their life. I have heard so many times from patients the following words, namely, "I have never been so alive as when I heard that doctor say I was dead." Because what people say is, at this point, they seem to leave their bodies. They get out of their bodies and they rise up, typically to a point over their physical body. Or sometimes, for example, Socrates formulated this same thing by saying, not that I got out of my body, but that I withdrew from my body. And I think that's an interesting distinction, because to say I got out of my body sort of puts the locus of self-identity in the body. But Socrates' perspective was, I withdrew from my body, whereas the perspective is from out of the body. And people say that in this state, they say that they can see clearly what's going on down below them. They see the doctors and nurses trying to resuscitate them. And they can understand the communications that are going back and forth between this doctor and the nurse. But they say it's not as though they hear an audible voice, but rather they become aware of what the doctor and nurse are saying by a sort of heart-to-heart or mind-to-mind understanding. And at a certain point, they realize that this is something to do with the process of dying. And they say at that point, their consciousness passes through a tube or a tunnel or a passageway of some sort, and they come out on the other side into an incredibly brilliant and warm and loving light. Far brighter, they say, than anything we have ever experienced while we are alive. And in that light, they tell us often that they see relatives or friends of theirs who have already died. And these loved ones are there almost in the role of a greeting committee to help them across this divide. Incidentally, when people report this experience, they say it's not like seeing the physical form of a person there. There is a form, but it's not a physical form that they find very difficult to describe. But they recognize their loved ones through the sense of personal presence and through the memories that emerge and so on. And at some point, the way it's often described to me, they say that the light grows brighter and everything else just sort of disappears. And they find themselves surrounded by a full-color, holographic panorama of everything they've ever done. And interestingly enough, because language is sequential, that when they report this panorama to us, they must recount it as though it were sequential. But in the experiencing of it, it's not sequential. Rather, they say that in this state, time and as you and I are experiencing it now, is not a factor, that in effect there is no time. And they say that each event or action they see in this panorama, instantaneous panorama, that when they review it, they do not review it through the eyes and feelings they had when they were doing the action. Rather, they tell us that it's as though they are embedded empathically in the consciousness of the person with whom they interacted in this action. And if, therefore, they see themselves doing a mean-spirited action to one of their fellow human beings, then in this panorama they feel directly the hurt they brought about in that person's life. Or they say if they see themselves doing a kind-hearted action, then they feel the good feelings they brought about in that person's life. And so I want to pause at this moment to say this, that one thing I always teach my logic students is, from any bit of information or data that you're trying to draw a conclusion from, it's always best to draw the very minimal conclusion you can, because then you're safer. And so as I reflect on it, quite apart from any questions about the afterlife, I think that we can, with absolute safety, draw a conclusion from these life reviews that to me is utterly startling in its implications. And that is, if you think about it, what this means is that at least for some of us, life is a two-phase process. That is, first we live life forward as the actor or protagonist. Then at the end of life, there's this turnaround, and we review identically the same action from the point of view of the other characters involved. It makes me wonder whether people who have had a profound near-death experience, when they come back from it, are therefore in a third phase of life. Heraclitus said this very beautifully, I think. He said that those who have survived an apparent death, he said, are appointed to watch over the living and the dead, that they have a sort of intermediate position in life. The Greeks call them the walkers between worlds. Now, obviously, all of these people with whom I've talked anyway have to come back. And here we have an interesting variation. Some people say they have no idea how they got back. At one moment they were in this light, the next moment they were back in their bodies with no sense of transition. Others will tell us that they were told they had to come back. They have things left to do. And incidentally, I've never met anyone in all my career who understands why they were sent back. They were only told, you have to go back, you have things left to do. But they're not given any clue as to why. And that must be, if you think about it, a terribly frustrating state. Others are told that they're given a choice. They say you can either go back to the life you've been leading, and or else you can stay in this state that you're in now. Yes. And the most common reason people give why they came back is they had young children left to raise. And they say that for themselves, they would rather have stayed in the light, but they chose to come back to serve their children. Also, I was a forensic psychiatrist working for a while in a maximum security unit for the criminally insane. So my daily work was to talk with people who had committed homicide. And just recently, I found about the most astonishingly interesting case that involved a homicide. Yes, and this was a case of a young woman who was assaulted by a serial killer in Colorado, and she narrowly survived. But she saw another woman be killed by this man. So she was taken into the hospital, and it was really a miracle that she lived. But the homicide investigator in this case reported that when she was finally able to interview this woman who almost died, she said the woman said that during her ordeal, she was almost dead and she went into the white light. And she was told that she had a choice, that she could either stay in the light or she could go back to earth. And she told the detective that the reason why she came back was that she knew that she was the only one who could identify the serial killer. And indeed, she did testify at the trial in which the serial killer was convicted, and she was the essential witness who was able to say who it was. Now, when people get back, then the interesting part from the point of view of a psychiatrist occurred. Because people who have this experience, their life afterward is deeply affected by what they experience. And one thing I have observed as a psychiatrist that is just astonishing to me is that every patient I ever had, I realized was chasing something. Some people are chasing power. Some people are chasing fame. Some people are chasing money, whatever they're chasing. I remember after a few months of this, I went to my psychiatric supervisor, John Buckman. And so I said to John, John, this is really interesting. Everybody, all these people seem to be chasing something. Some chasing money, power, or fame. And I said, because I can't relate to it because I'm not chasing anything. So John smiled and he said, how old were you when you finished your second doctoral degree, Raymond? And I said, 30 years old. I got the point. I've spent my life chasing knowledge. But whatever we're chasing and whatever one has been chasing in life, when people come back from this experience, they say that what they realized through their experience, that what this life is all about is learning how to love. I immediately want to go on to say that people say that it doesn't make that task much easier to have had a near-death experience. They come back with this vision of the importance of love, but that it's very difficult to put that into practice on a day-to-day basis. This wonderful psychiatrist that I mentioned earlier, Dr. George Ritchie, one day in 1976, he said to me, Raymond, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way. And George was a very kind-hearted and polite person, and he wouldn't have said it this way, but I'm going to put in plain terms what he was getting at. And that is, let's face it, it's very difficult to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person. And that remains intact. You still have things where you fly off the handle and say things you would wish you hadn't have. But it does give people an ideal, I think, to strive for. Now, another thing that people say is that after this experience, they have absolutely no more fear of death. Not that they would want to die in a painful or unpleasant way, but that they are completely comfortable as death comes, that they are no longer afraid. Because they say that their experience convinces them that what we call death is simply a passage into some other realm of existence. And that brings us to the question that really many people want to know about near-death experiences. And that is, are these experiences evidence of an afterlife? And we all know the standard objection to that, and that is that people say, well, what's going on here is that when the oxygen flow is deprived to the brain, then this creates a hallucinatory phenomenon. So this is an illusion that is caused by the disturbance in the brain function. And I want to say that I have never really taken that objection seriously. And the reason is two reasons. The hypothesis, the philosophical position, called epiphenomenalism is the claim that consciousness has no independent reality, that it's simply an artifact or an offshoot of the primary and only reality, which is the brain substance and the electrochemical reactions going on in it. That's right. And in reality, it may be nice to pretend otherwise, but in reality, the mind-body problem is still a philosophical problem. That's right. And it's not yet a problem that can be empirically confirmed or denied. And also another reason that I reject the oxygen deprivation hypothesis is that it is very common for bystanders at the death of someone else, that as that person dies, the bystanders themselves have all of these features that we call near-death experience. The bystanders talking about at the point of the death of their loved ones, they themselves may leave their bodies and travel partway toward this light with their dying relatives. And incredibly, that includes even this panoramic life review. In some cases, the bystanders empathically co-live the dying life review of the person who passes away. In about 1989 or 90, I met a woman, an elderly woman, who told me that as her husband was dying in the hospital, she was embracing him. And as he was dying, she found that they were surrounded by this panorama of scenes from his life. And she was conversing with her husband about the scenes in this panorama as he was dying. Maybe we can understand that a little bit when it's a close loved one, but I have cases in which the same phenomenon was reported, for example, by a physician who was called to the emergency room to resuscitate a patient that he had never known before, and told me that as the patient was dying, he was surrounded by these images that he gathered were the life review of his dying patient. And I must confess, I don't know about you, but this idea that somebody might be a co-spectator in your life review is very uncomfortable to me. I'm not even looking forward to my own life review, much less having a spectator there. So what these shared death experiences as they are show, I think, is that some other factor or factors than oxygen deprivation to the brain are involved in these experiences. About 2 years ago, lecturing in Italy, and after my lecture, a surgeon approached me. And I should say that you could tell by this man's eyes that he had experienced something that had deeply changed him. So he took me aside and he related the following experience. Some months before, he had been doing an elective surgical procedure on a fairly young man who was in overall good health. And there was just no thought that anything bad might happen during the surgery. But during the surgery, the man did suffer a cardiac arrest, and the surgeon was unable to revive him. So he told me he was astonished and unbelieving and just say, oh my God, what happened? How did this happen? What am I going to tell the family? And so suddenly, he said, the operating room doors swung open and a woman came in raving and yelling. He said at first he thought that this woman was psychotic. But you know how when you're stressed, it's hard to understand what somebody else is saying to you. So he said he couldn't understand what she was saying, so he had to focus on her face to try to figure out what she was saying. And he said he realized what she was saying was, my husband is not dead. She said, I was out in the waiting room, and my husband came to me, and he said that you think he's dead, and I should come in here and tell you that he's not dead. And so he said he doesn't even remember resuming the resuscitation. He went on automatic. And he said,
Mais il
after
l'a
a
fait.
while, the man's heart started beating again. And he told me that he was actually there in the recovery room when the patient regained consciousness. And so he said the patient said to him, I was out of my body up there, and I could tell you thought I was dead. And I kept trying to tell you I wasn't dead, but you wouldn't hear me. So I went out into the waiting room to tell my wife to come in here and tell you that
Donc je
I'm
suis
not
allée
dead.
dans la...
And really, I could relate to you many other equally puzzling accounts that have given to me by physicians who had similar experiences when they were dealing with patients during resuscitation. And I am temperamentally a skeptic, although I don't like to use that word because it has been misconstrued in the general vernacular. The skeptical movement, no matter what modern day how people use that term today, the skeptical movement was initiated by Pyrrho of Athens about 20 years after the death of Aristotle. And the essence of skepticism is that, number one, it arose in the context of logic because Aristotle had codified logic, the very logic we use today, about 20 years before.
Étudier la logique.
So what this Pyrrho thought was, he thought, well, we now have a system of rules and procedures that enables us to draw a conclusion. That's what logic is. So Pyrrho asked, what would happen if we don't draw the conclusion? And that is the essence of the skeptical movement. And what they found was that if you practice that method assiduously of refusing to draw a conclusion, then two things happen. Number one, it expands your mind in a way that's very desirable for it to be expanded. It's a very pleasant experience. And secondly, if you think about it geometrically and everybody else is running in this direction to get to the conclusion, then if you think about it geometrically, what that does is that it opens up your peripheral vision and you see side pathways of inquiry that everybody else had missed because they're focused in this direction. And I think, to acknowledge it frankly, the issue of life after death is a very difficult question to draw logical inferences about. That's the reality. In my own opinion, I should say at the beginning is that I am not a parapsychologist, because I think that in 2017, the question of life after death, which is the most important question of existence, is not yet in a situation where it can be confirmed or disconfirmed by scientific method. And I think, in my opinion, there are two figures in history who have said the clearest and most accurate things about the rational difficulty of establishing proof of an afterlife. And the first is Plato. I think that Plato's Phaedo is clearly the best, most clearly argued and thought out contribution to the question of rational proof of an afterlife. One of Plato's big points in that dialogue is, I think, a very important point to realize, and that is that whenever we think about the afterlife from the point of view of the rational process, there are always two important factors we have to take into account from the very beginning. And one factor is that because the notion of an afterlife is so obscure, there always has to be a story or a narrative to get started, to get the thinking started. And incidentally, the Greeks knew about the same kind of narratives that we know about. I got out of my body, I went through a tunnel into a light, I came back to my body, and so on. The same kind of story. But even if we had 1 million stories, that would not add up to a proof of an afterlife. What we need in addition is some set of concepts that can lead us from the experiences to the statement that there is life after death, some set of concepts. And I think in the modern world we've leaped too quickly to the concepts of scientific method, because personally, as I said, I don't think that scientific method is, at least in 2017, a coherent method. The afterlife is not yet a scientific question. So we need some new set of concepts to lead us forward in the investigation of life after death. And I think that that was best stated by David Hume, who lived from 1711 to 1776. Hume was one of the founders of the scientific mind because he explored the notion of causation and the inductive logic that we use in science. And I'm going to quote for you what Hume said, and I think that if you follow these words along in your mind as you hear them, that you will see that what he said was very accurate. So what Hume said was, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Some new species of logic is required for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And that, I think, is the actual situation. The logic we have and the cognitive faculties that we possess at present are simply insufficient to get rational enlightenment on the question of an afterlife. And I think Hume was probably implying that that was impossible. Because if you think about it, Aristotle's logic has served us very well for 2,300 years. And also, we think we know our minds fairly well, and it seems very unlikely that we could have mental faculties or cognitive faculties that would enable us to comprehend any sort of new logic. And so, I think that Hume was right in what he said, that he identified the problem correctly.
Et je pense que
But I think he was incorrect in his assumption that it's impossible to fulfill that criterion, because I do think that we can articulate new rational principles that are a kind of logic, a new logic. If I could explain, and this is something that Jean Staune and I are very interested in, you know, the logic we use in everyday life is a binary code, has true and false. Okay? Now, Aristotelian logic and other codes of logic are predicated on literal meaning. If something is unintelligible, if an idea doesn't make any logical sense, then we can't think about it using the logic of Aristotle. In fact, if you think about it, the idea of a logic of unintelligible things seems self-contradictory. However, that creates a difficulty for rational investigations of the afterlife, because when we say the words life after death, ideas come to our mind and images and thoughts, so we assume that the sentence has some sort of meaning. And if you think about it, though, the sentence, there is life after death, is a self-contradiction, because death simply means the state from which you don't live anymore. Death is the final irreversible cessation of life. So if you say there is life after death, then what you're saying in a larger form is there is life after the final irreversible cessation of life, and that is a self-contradiction. That's right. So the sentence, as appealing as it may be, the notion that there is life after death, that cannot be put into the framework of the logic that we use for thinking about our daily affairs and our academic thoughts. And that is where my main interest in philosophy of language and logic comes in. Because the problem I have been working on for over 50 years is, can there be a logic of the unintelligible? And so my answer that I assume to be true is that yes, it is possible to reason logically about things that have no meaning. And so that is the subject of the book that Jean has been so kind to publish for me. So I am going to suggest that we do now have a sort of breakthrough in the genuine rational investigation of the question of an afterlife. And so here it is, and I ask for your opinion, because one thing I learned very early in life, my primary interest when I was a kid was astronomy, which is still one of my favorite subjects. And I remember very well, just as though it were yesterday, the first time I ever looked through a telescope. And I remember at that point having a distinct thought that I am never going to know much of anything in reality. Because in cosmology, we have many very important questions that nonetheless are, I think, perhaps even unintelligible. So the first thing I want to admit is that I may be wrong about this. And so the fun of it to me is that I've worked on this for over 50 years, and I have put it down as clearly as I can. And now I invite you to read through it and see for yourself and to see what you think. And I'm perfectly open to the possibility of refutation. I may be wrong. But if I am right, then we do have entirely new rational means of investigating the afterlife question now. I think that if we equip people in advance with a logic of nonsense in addition to the literal logic of Aristotle, then subsequently some people who have this new logic in their mind will happen by chance to have a near-death experience. And I conjecture that under those circumstances, someone who goes into their near-death experience already having principles of unintelligibility in the background will be able to articulate this experience in an entirely new way. And I suspected for years and years that eventually that would happen. Well, to my great relief, October the 15th, 2015, about a year and a few months ago, it did occur. A man who is a distinguished artist and scientist in the United States, some years ago, participated in one of my seminars in which I was teaching this new logic. So on October 15th, 2015, he called me, and he called me to tell about his near-death experience primarily. And he had been through a terrible ordeal. He developed H1N1 flu, and he almost died several times during that period. He developed gangrene in his leg and had to have his leg amputated. He was in the hospital at the point of death for 60 days, and during that time had 3 cardiac arrests in which he had near-death experience. And that was really the point of his calling me to tell about his near-death experience. But his voice was very weak, and just like from the illness, his voice sounded very weak. But suddenly I noticed a dramatic change in the energy of his voice and the clarity of it. And he said to me, just sort of incidentally, or, as a remark, he said, and Raymond, when I was in that near-death state, my mind went back to the nonsense seminar that I participated in. And he said, and I realized that you were right. He said that in order to understand the connection between the other realms of existence and this realm, he said you absolutely have to take the unintelligibility axis into account. And I think that other cases of that will emerge. So I do think we have now a different rational modality to investigate the question of an afterlife. I want to conclude by saying a few words about grief, which is, I know, that's why many of you are here. And what I would say is that we can't yet prove that there's an afterlife. That's the reality. But I do think that we are justified in taking hope from these near-death experiences. Grief, as terrible as the experience is in the passage of time, it's a learning experience that is valuable in itself. And there is nothing whatsoever that would justify to me the death of my infant son. And at the same time, at age 72, I reflect that because of my experience, that I have been able to help many others who are in the process of grieving. And again, I want to say thank you, France. I mean, it's great. A magical place. Thank you so much.